Nobody told them royalty was coming. That is the part that stays with you. Not the burgundy suit. Not the cameras waiting outside. Not the carefully worded Kensington Palace statement that would follow. What stays with you is the image of a break room full of nurses and volunteers sitting with their tea, shoulders still carrying the weight of a brutal winter flu season, and then the door opening. And the gasps. They were told VIPs were coming. That was all. The word VIP in an NHS hospital in January can mean a lot of things. A local counsellor. A charitable donor. Someone with a check and a camera. Nobody in that break room at Charing Cross Hospital in West London on the morning of January 8, 2026, had any real reason to expect the Prince and Princess of Wales to walk through the door. And yet there they were. William in a brown blazer over a navy jumper, relaxed and warm. Catherine in a deep burgundy trouser suit, her hair down, carrying a small handbag, looking like someone who had made a quiet but deliberate choice to be exactly where she was. The gasps were immediate. A royal correspondent who was present described it plainly. The staff and volunteers were not aware. All they had been told was VIPs were coming. And then, the prince and princess walked in. Gasps. That word, gasps, carries more weight than any formal announcement ever could. To understand why that morning at Charing Cross landed the way it did, you have to understand what the 12 months before it looked like. You have to understand what Catherine had been carrying, what William had been watching her carry, and what it means for two people to walk back into a hospital corridor not as patients or as family members of patients, but as themselves, whole and present and grateful. January 2025 had started with a statement that made millions of people exhale. Catherine, Princess of Wales, announced she had completed her course of chemotherapy. The cancer she had been diagnosed with in 2024, the details of which she had shared in a deeply personal video that had reached every corner of the world, was in remission. She was well. She was getting stronger. She was coming back. The relief from the public was real and enormous, the kind that does not perform itself but simply sits in people's chests like something loosened. But remission is not a finish line. Anyone who has walked alongside someone through cancer treatment knows this. The body is still in recovery. The mind is still sorting through what happened to it. The world outside is still spinning at its usual relentless pace, and the question of when to step back into it, how much to step back into it, and what to do first when you do, is not a simple one. Catherine had spent 2025 finding her footing again. Slowly, carefully, with evident thought. She had re-engaged with her royal duties and stages, attending events that held real meaning for her, appearing with William and their 3 children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, at moments that mattered. By the end of that year, the photographs from their Christmas card had shown a family that looked, for perhaps the first time in a long time, genuinely settled. Peaceful. Like something had been resolved. The move had helped. In the autumn of 2025, William and Catherine had left Adelaide Cottage, the relatively modest home they had chosen when they relocated to Windsor, and moved into Forest Lodge, a Grade 2 listed 8-bedroom house set inside Windsor Great Park. It was a bigger home, a more private one, and, by all accounts, a deliberate step toward building the kind of stable, rooted life they had long said they wanted for their children and for themselves. The new year arrived and, with it, the sense that 2026 would be different. More settled. More forward-facing. The year, in the words of people who followed them closely, when they would truly begin to step into what came next. And what came next, on January 8, was a break room at Charing Cross. Ordinary. Deliberate. Quietly astonishing. The visit was originally William's alone. That detail matters enormously. He had been scheduled to attend as joint patron of NHS Charities Together, the umbrella organization representing more than 220 NHS charities across every trust and health board in the United Kingdom. The couple had taken on that patronage together back in December 2020, at the height of the COVID pandemic, when the NHS had been carrying a weight that the whole country was only beginning to understand. It had felt like the right thing to do at the time, and it had stayed the right thing to do for every year since. William showing up on a cold January morning to honor that commitment, to look healthcare workers in the eyes during a difficult winter season and say "we see you" was entirely consistent with who he had always been. But Catherine decided she wanted to come too. Kensington Palace, with the careful economy of language that royal communications always employ, said the princess had wanted to join her husband to show her support for the NHS and to thank the teams at Charing Cross for their efforts over a difficult winter period. Simple enough, on its surface. But, when you set that sentence against everything the previous year had contained, it becomes something else entirely. Catherine had spent months on the receiving end of the kind of care those corridors represent. She had sat in treatment rooms. She had watched the hours pass. She had understood from the inside what it cost the people in those buildings, every day, to keep doing what they did. When she decided to walk back in, not as a patient this time but as a woman who had made it through and wanted to say so, she was doing something that went well beyond a patronage obligation. The staff did not know she was coming. Nobody had adjusted the itinerary on the public calendar. She simply came. The NHS Charities Together organization had organized the event specifically as an acknowledgement of the incredible work of NHS staff over a difficult winter period. Britain's winters had been punishing on the health service for years, and the winter of 2025 into 2026 had brought the usual brutal combination of respiratory viruses, understaffing pressures, and a public demand that never paused. The volunteers and staff gathered in that break room were people who had been showing up anyway, every shift, without any particular expectation of recognition. The break room itself had been funded by Imperial Health Charity, one of the member organizations of NHS Charities Together, which supports all 5 hospitals under the Imperial College Healthcare NHS Trust. It was a small room paid for by people who believed that a place to sit and breathe mattered. William and Catherine walked into it and proved them right. Chief Executive of NHS Charities Together, Gail Scott-Spicer, said afterward that they were delighted to have been able to thank their hard-working NHS staff and volunteers with what she called a surprise event, made all the more special by the generous attendance of the Prince and Princess. Made all the more special. There is something in that phrase that points to what the morning actually was. Not a formal royal engagement in the traditional sense, though it functioned as one. Not a photo opportunity, though photographs were taken and shared. Something closer to a gesture. 2 people who had lived inside the orbit of the NHS in very different ways, one as a pilot who had worked alongside air ambulance crews and understood the weight of emergency medicine from the inside, and one as a patient who had been cared for by the very kind of people now sitting across from her in a hospital break room, deciding together to show up and say thank you. Without ceremony. Without a formal announcement. With gasps. The NHS itself had been woven into the fabric of both their lives in ways that went beyond patronage paperwork. William had spent 2 years as a full-time pilot with the East Anglian Air Ambulance, landing at accident scenes, working alongside paramedics, coming to understand the machinery of emergency care not from a distance but from within it. He had spoken about those years with evident feeling on multiple occasions, and his commitment to the NHS as an institution had always felt rooted in something real rather than something performed. For Catherine, the relationship had deepened in the most personal way imaginable during her treatment in 2024. The Royal Marsden, the specialist cancer hospital where she received care, had become a place she had made a point of returning to in January 2025 to thank the staff who had looked after her. A royal photographer who was present that day later described watching her glance up at the sign on the door as she arrived, just for a moment, as if the memory of what that building had meant to her passed briefly across her face before she composed herself and walked in. She knew what hospitals felt like from the inside now. She knew the particular quality of the hours in a treatment room, the way time moved differently there, the way the people around you became important in a way that was hard to explain to anyone who had not experienced it. When a volunteer at Charing Cross told her and William how patients and visitors would sit in the chemotherapy unit for hours, Catherine's reply was 2 words. I know. She touched William's shoulder as she said it. Looked at him. And then, she added, quietly, you know. He did. They both did. The year behind them had put that knowledge into them permanently, and they had walked back into a hospital corridor carrying it, not as something to speak about at length but as something to act from. To show up from. To stand in a break room with cold-handed nurses and tea-drinking volunteers and say, without needing to explain it, we see this. We know what this costs. And we came. That is the beginning of the story. It starts with gasps. There is a particular kind of courage that does not look like courage at all. It does not raise its voice. It does not announce itself. It simply walks down a hospital corridor with good posture and a warm expression, stops at a ward that helps people rebuild their ability to move after neurological illness, and says, with something that sounds like genuine wonder, there's some amazing work going on here. We've just seen some of it today. It makes a big difference to patients' lives. Catherine said those words standing in the rehabilitation unit at Charing Cross Hospital, and the people around her received them the way people receive words that come from somewhere real. Not from a script. Not from a briefing note. From a woman who had spent the better part of 2 years learning, in the most intimate and involuntary way possible, what it means to depend on medical care to get your life back. What made the morning at Charing Cross so layered was the quiet accumulation of details that each carried their own weight. The fact that it was Catherine's birthday. She was turning 44 that day, January 9th in the British calendar, and she had chosen to spend the morning before the celebrations in a hospital corridor, talking to people she had never met, about work that most of the country only thought about when they needed it. The fact that it came just days before the first anniversary of the day in January 2025 when she had stood in front of a camera and told the world her cancer was in remission. Both things were sitting in the room with her that morning even though neither of them was spoken aloud directly. The birthday. The anniversary. They were the backdrop against which every exchange, every handshake, every moment of eye contact with a nurse on her tea break, was silently set. William had arrived prepared, as he always did, but what the morning drew out of him was something beyond preparation. He had made this kind of visit before, many times, and he was comfortable in these settings in the way that comes from genuine interest rather than trained obligation. But something about this particular morning, about the combination of his wife standing beside him and the people in front of them and the specific weight of the year they had both just lived through, made him speak differently. During the roundtable that followed the ward visits, where he sat down with NHS charity chief executives and trustees and policymakers and philanthropists to discuss the role of charitable giving in the health service, he was direct in a way that reached beyond the usual language of royal engagement. He said that the power of philanthropy in the NHS had been undervalued for years. He said we all applauded the NHS for many weeks through COVID. He added, this kind of feels like a bit of a moment to remind ourselves why we did all of that applauding. And then, he talked about hospitals, about what they meant, about the specific relationship between patient and carer that formed inside them, and he brought Catherine into it without making it sentimental or performative. He said both of them had had different experiences with hospitals. Him, working with the air ambulance. Her, through her recent health journey. Coming there that day reminded them both of how important all the teams were, all the staff, the patient interactions. He called it heartwarming. He said it was important to acknowledge and appreciate all that goes on, and that very strong bond between patient and carer. The bond between patient and carer. He chose that phrase and then sat with it. Nobody in the room would have missed what was underneath it. What is worth understanding about NHS Charities Together, the organization that had brought them there, is the scale of what it represents. More than 220 NHS charities, one connected to every NHS trust and health board across the entire United Kingdom, giving an average of £1.5 million every day to the health service. The money funds equipment that budgets cannot stretch to cover. It funds the green spaces and the arts programs that hospitals use to help patients heal in ways that medicine alone cannot achieve. It funds staff well-being initiatives, because the NHS had learned, especially through the years of the pandemic and everything that came after, that the people doing the caring needed caring for too. The break room at Charing Cross was not an accident. It was a deliberate investment in the idea that a nurse who has somewhere to sit and breathe for 20 minutes comes back to the ward as a better nurse. That idea had been funded by people who gave money to Imperial Health Charity. And Imperial Health Charity was part of NHS Charities Together. And William and Catherine had been joint patrons of NHS Charities Together since December 2020. 6 years of that patronage had given them a deep understanding of the organization's work. But something had shifted in the way they held that understanding now. Catherine's cancer diagnosis in 2024 and the treatment that followed had placed her on the other side of the equation that the charity existed to address. She had been the patient. She had been the person in the chair. She had been the person for whom a good nurse and a funded well-being program and a break room that did not feel like a utility closet made a difference that was hard to quantify but impossible to miss. Walking back into a hospital as a patron rather than a patient required her to hold both things at once, and she did it with the kind of composure that only comes from having already done the harder thing. The volunteer she spoke to most directly that morning worked with people undergoing chemotherapy. The volunteer described how people sat in the unit for hours during their treatment, patients and visitors side by side, waiting together in that specific suspended quality of time that only treatment rooms contain. Catherine listened to this description with an expression that was not pity and was not performance. She said I know and she meant it literally. Then, she looked at William and said you know. He did. He had been there. Not as the patient but as the person beside the patient, which is its own form of knowing, equally permanent and differently shaped. The chemistry between them throughout the morning was noted by everyone present and by the vast audience who would later see the photographs shared to the Prince and Princess of Wales's Instagram account. The images showed Catherine in her Roland Mouret burgundy trouser suit, a piece she had worn before and returned to for reasons that were perhaps both practical and pointed. It was a suit that had been in her wardrobe since 2022, updated for this occasion with a high-neck blouse in the same deep tone, creating a look that read as composed and warm simultaneously. The monochromatic depth of the burgundy was the color of something serious, something decided. William's brown blazer and navy jumper offered a contrast that together made them look like two people who had dressed that morning with a shared instinct rather than a coordinated plan. His casualness against her precision. Her burgundy against his earth tones. The photographs were beautiful in the way that photographs are when they capture something true rather than something arranged. People across the world responded to those photographs with the particular warmth that Catherine and William had been generating from the public since the hardest year of their private lives had become, through Catherine's own choice, partially a public story. When she had made her video announcing her diagnosis in March 2024, sitting in a garden chair in the gentle afternoon light, speaking about the shock of what she had learned and asking for time and privacy, she had given people something rare, honesty from a royal, delivered without the usual protective layers of institutional distance. And people had responded to that honesty with a kind of love that was not the usual celebrity adulation but something more personal, more protective. They had watched her go through something terrifying and they had come out the other side of it still watching, still holding some part of that experience with her. When the pictures from Charing Cross appeared, the comments came in waves. One person wrote that the princess looked radiant, so wonderful to see her supporting the NHS. Another wrote of an absolute love for their wonderful Prince and Princess of Wales. These were not unusual things to write about royals. But the feeling underneath them was unusual. It was the feeling of people who had been genuinely worried about someone they cared about and were now genuinely relieved. The visit operated on multiple levels simultaneously, which is the hallmark of a royal engagement that is doing its job properly. On the surface it was a patron visit, a chance for the future king and queen to show their appreciation for the NHS, to shine a light on the work of NHS charities, to remind the public and the policymakers in the room that voluntary giving to the health service was not a luxury or a substitute for proper funding but a vital layer of support that made real differences in real wards to real people every day. At that level the visit was straightforward and effective and entirely appropriate to the gravity of the winter flu crisis that was grinding through the health service at that moment. Beneath that surface was something else. Two people who had been genuinely changed by the year behind them, walking back into the kind of building that had shaped those changes, doing the kind of work that had always defined them, but doing it now from a different place inside themselves. The hospitals William had worked alongside as an air ambulance pilot had taught him what emergency medicine looked like from the ground, the urgency and the weight of it. The hospital that had treated Catherine had taught her something that no amount of charitable patronage could teach, the specific human texture of being cared for when you are most afraid. Together those two kinds of knowledge made their presence at Charing Cross that morning into something that the nurses in the break room, even before they knew who was coming, had already earned. The organization that had brought them there had existed for 25 years by that point. A quarter of a century of NHS charities working together, pooling resources, funding innovation, transforming the way care was delivered in hospitals across the entire country. The visit was in part a recognition of that milestone, a marker of continuity between the patronage William and Catherine had taken on during the pandemic and the moment, 6 years later, when the full personal meaning of that commitment had been revealed. Not by anything dramatic. By two people walking into a break room on a cold January morning and letting a room full of tired, dedicated, essential human beings feel, for a few minutes, genuinely seen. That is what a surprise means when it comes from the right people at the right time. Not shock. Not spectacle. Recognition. By the time William and Catherine left Charing Cross Hospital that morning, something had shifted in the way the public understood where they were going. Not literally. They drove back to Windsor, to their new home in Forest Lodge, to the children and the ordinary domestic life they had been quietly rebuilding all through the second half of the previous year. That part was unremarkable. But the morning they had just spent had functioned, in the way that certain public moments do, as a kind of signal. Not orchestrated, not packaged with that intent, but received that way nonetheless. People watching the photographs and the footage from Charing Cross were not simply seeing a royal couple on a charity visit. They were seeing two people who had been through something serious together and had come out of it with their sense of purpose not diminished but deepened. They were seeing the first clear view of what William and Catherine intended 2026 to be. The year had already announced itself as different before the hospital visit. The Christmas card at the end of 2025 had been widely noted for its warmth, its unusual intimacy, the sense that the family in the photograph was showing people something real rather than something curated. The New Year's Instagram post, which moved through 12 photographs from the year gone by, had been quietly revealing. A royal editor analyzing the images pointed out immediately that only one of the 12 featured any of the Wales children. The others showed William and Catherine at engagements, at events, marking occasions. The message, whether deliberate or simply honest, was that a line had been drawn. The children's lives were protected. The couple's working life was being opened up. The two things were being separated with a new deliberateness, a new clarity about what belonged to the public and what did not. Forest Lodge was part of that clarity. Adelaide Cottage, the 4-bedroom home they had moved into when they first relocated to Windsor from London, had always felt like a transitional choice, a gesture toward normality and modesty at a time when they were still figuring out what their life in Windsor would look like. Forest Lodge, sitting deeper inside Windsor Great Park, surrounded by trees, larger and more private, felt like something they had chosen for keeps. It had the quality of a decision made by people who knew what they wanted now and were ready to build it. The children could grow up there. The work could expand from there. The future, which for the past 2 years had looked uncertain in ways that were frightening to contemplate, could be planned from there. The NHS visit slotted into that expanding working life as the first major public engagement of the new year and did everything a first engagement should do. It told people something true about where William and Catherine's priorities sat. It demonstrated that their charitable commitments were not nominal, not maintained at a ceremonial distance, but rooted in genuine feeling and genuine experience. And it did something harder to plan and impossible to manufacture: it moved people. Not in the way that elaborate royal ceremonies move people, with the weight of pageantry and history pressing down on a moment. In the way that simple human gestures move people when they come from the right place. A woman who had been through chemotherapy, speaking 2 words to a volunteer who helped chemotherapy patients. I know. The entire previous 2 years compressed into that. The diagnosis. The surgery. The treatment. The recovery. The careful, patient, painful return to herself and to her life. All of it contained in 2 words spoken quietly in a hospital corridor. The fans who responded to the visit were not wrong to feel what they felt. The public relationship with Catherine in particular had deepened during her illness in a way that was worth understanding. When she had made her cancer announcement video in March 2024, the response had been massive and immediate, but what had distinguished it from ordinary celebrity sympathy was its quality. It was not the breathless, consuming attention that celebrity crisis usually generates. It was quieter than that and more sustained. People had worried about her in the way you worry about someone you feel you know, which is the peculiar intimacy that certain public figures create over years of being genuinely themselves in public view. Catherine had been photographed and reported on for more than a decade by that point, and what had accumulated in the public mind was not a performance but a person. Someone who held her children's hands with visible tenderness. Someone who got on the ground to talk to small children at eye level. Someone who turned up at hospices and addiction recovery centers and early childhood programs not with the glazed politeness of obligation but with the focused curiosity of someone who actually wanted to understand what she was looking at. When that person had become ill, people had felt it. And, when she had recovered, they had felt that too. The photographs from Charing Cross showing her radiant in burgundy, laughing at something William said, leaning toward a nurse with the expression of someone who was genuinely interested in what the nurse had to tell her, landed with the particular power of a before and after that nobody had asked for but everybody was relieved to see. This is what the other side looks like. This is what it looks like to come through. William had always been slightly harder to read than Catherine in terms of public feeling, partly because his position as the heir to the throne came with a gravity that made straightforward warmth harder to project, and partly because the years of navigating his father's reign and his own family's difficulties had sometimes given him the look of a man managing a great deal that was not visible on the surface. But Charing Cross showed a different version of him, or rather showed a version that those who had watched him closely over the years had always known was there. He was natural in that break room. Easy. He asked staff if they'd had a good New Year, whether they were all busy at work, with the ease of someone who knew how to talk to people doing hard jobs without performing it. His speech to the round table had the quality of thought that had been sitting with him for a long time before he was asked to give it. The undervaluing of philanthropy in the NHS, the applause during COVID that had not been followed by the kind of sustained attention the health service needed, the specific bond between patient and carer that could be supported but not replaced by money, these were not talking points. They were convictions. Together, that morning, they demonstrated the kind of partnership that the concept of a future king and queen can mean at its best. Not the ceremonial weight of crowns and scepters and processions. The practical weight of two people who care about the same things, who have been through something together that has changed them, showing up somewhere that matters and staying present for long enough to make the presence count. The round table after the ward visits lasted as long as it needed to. They did not arrive, shake hands, pose for photographs, and leave. They sat down with the people doing the work and talked about the work with the seriousness it deserved. The NHS charity chief executives and trustees in that room went home having had a conversation, not an audience. None of this was accidental. The couple had spent the entire previous year in a process that looked from the outside like gradual recovery and was in reality something more like deliberate reconstruction. Reconstruction of Catherine's health, yes, but also reconstruction of the shape of their public life together, the purpose it was going to serve, the version of the future monarchy it was going to model. In a year when the institution of the royal family had faced pressures from multiple directions, some familiar and some new, William and Catherine had been quietly building something sturdy. The new home. The careful re-engagement with charitable work. The protection of the children's lives from public view. The decision, when Catherine was well enough, to come back not with fanfare but with substance. The 25th anniversary of NHS Charities Together provided a framework for the visit, but the meaning of the morning went further than any anniversary. It went to the question of what patronage means when it is practiced by people who have skin in the game. William had skin in the game because he had spent years flying alongside the emergency services that the NHS supported. Catherine had skin in the game in the most direct way possible. The charity that had supported the hospitals where people like her were treated had been their patron responsibility since 2020. Standing in Charing Cross on Catherine's 44th birthday, just days before the anniversary of her remission announcement, they were not simply honoring an institutional relationship. They were returning something. The way you return to a place that has given you something immeasurable and look the people there in the eye and try, in the limited way that is available to you, to give something back. The nurses went back to their shifts. The volunteers returned to the chemotherapy unit where people sat for hours. The chief executives went back to their offices to fight for funding and to make grants and to figure out how to stretch £1.5 million a day across the entire fabric of the NHS. William and Catherine drove home to Windsor, to George and Charlotte and Louis and the house in the park. The photographs went up on Instagram. The fans responded with love. And, somewhere in a break room at Charing Cross, paid for by people who believed that a place to breathe mattered, the story of that morning settled into the walls quietly, and stayed there. This is what they chose to do first. Of all the ways to begin a new year, of all the statements a prince and a future princess might make about who they are and what they intend, they chose a break room full of tired healthcare workers on a cold January morning, and they chose to show up without warning, and they let the work speak. That was the surprise. Not the arrival. The intention behind it. That is what the fans recognized when the gasps turned to photographs, turned to comments, turned to the particular warmth of people watching two people they had been worried about being, clearly and unmistakably, okay. More than okay. Present. Purposeful. Back.